The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that the first place within Eretz Yisrael, that its ownership went over practically to Avraham Avinu, was Chevron, as the Pasuk refers to it, Sdei HaMachpelah al Pnei Mamre hi Chevron. Now, even though, of course, earlier on by the Bris Ben Absarim, all of Eretz Yisrael was given over to Avraham Avinu and to his descendants after him, as the Pasuk says, L'zarach onasati es ha'aretz hazois, and even before that, Hashem had already told him, Kum ishalech ba'aretz, get up and walk the land in its length and in its breadth, because I'm going to give it to you. Nevertheless, the ownership, and through an act of acquisition, practically and in a public way, as the Pasuk says, in front of the eyes of Bnei Ches, in front of the people of all the city, of the whole city, this happened specifically by the Ma'aras HaMachpelah in Chevron. And from then on, of course, the Ma'aras HaMachpelah in Chevron belongs to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and to their children after them, to Am Bnei Yisrael. And as the Medrash says regarding the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, that this is one of three places that the nations of the world cannot have any complaints, cannot start up with a Yidden at all saying that it's stolen in your hands. And the three places are, number one, Ma'aras HaMachpelah, as well as the place of the Beis HaMikdash and the burial place of Yosef. In other words, the ownership of Yidden practically in Eretz Yisrael all started with the fact that Avraham Avinu bought the Ma'aras HaMachpelah for the burial of Sarah. As the Evan Ezra says, that this is one of the reasons why this story is even being told to us in this parasha. It's all to fulfill the words of Hashem to Avram, that this is going to become his heritage. Says the Rebbe, we know that all things in Torah are absolutely accurate. So it's understood that the fact that the first portion of Yidden in Eretz Yisrael is in Chevron is connected with something unique and special that Chevron has. The Rebbe says we could say that since Chevron, it's with Chevron that the ownership of Yidden in Eretz Yisrael began. That is why that this ownership specifically was made so public and in front of the eyes of the nations, also open and revealed for future times. And based on this, says the Rebbe, we'll also be able to explain a medrash in our parsha. That one of the reasons why Chevron is called Kiryas Arba is because it came up in the lottery for 4 owners. That is, first, went to Shevet Yehuda. Eventually, it went specifically to Kalev within Shevet Yehuda. And then it went to the Kohanim, and finally to the Leviim. And the question is, why does this make any difference? And why is this any sort of special quality of Chevron, the fact that it had these 4 owners? But really, says the Rebbe, we can explain that it's with this specifically, that this specifically brings out a special idea within the ownership of Yidden over Chevron, as will be explained. The Rebbe says, seemingly we would be able to say that one of the special qualities, one of the special advantages of in the ownership of Yidden over Chevron is due to the fact that Chevron was one of the Arei Miklot, one of the cities of refuge. In fact, it's hinted in the parsha itself, according to the way the Ragachover explains, the dialogue between Avraham Avinu and the Bnei Ches. Avram wants to buy the cave, B'ktsei Sadeu, at the very edge of the field. Why does he want to buy it at the edge of the field? Because the Beis HaKvaris, the cemetery of the Ir Miklat, specifically has to be at the outskirts of the city. So he was concerned if this is going to be an Ir Miklat, then the graves will be moved away if it's in the city proper. But the Bnei Ches were telling him, Nisi Elikim Ata B'Sechenu, you're a godly prince amongst us, you're a Nasi. And the grave of a Melech or a Nasi would never be moved. So now that we established that Chevron is one of the Ir Miklat, the Arei Miklat we know specifically were given to the Leviim. And in the ownership of Leviim over their cities, we find a certain advantage compared to the ownership of the Yidden in regards to other parts of Eretz Yisrael. The halacha is that if a Levi sold a field in one of his cities, or a house in one of their walled cities, then their ownership of these fields and houses would be very different to a regular Yid. That is, by a regular Yid, in the time when Yovel was, in the time when there was the Yovel, so if a Yid sold a field, he would not be able to buy it back, redeem it, force the seller to give it back to him for the money up until 2 years. Only 2 years later could he demand his field back and pay for it, of course. If it was a house in a walled city, then there's another halacha, that if he wants, he can redeem it within a year. again, a field after 2 years and a house in a walled city within a year. And if he doesn't redeem it within the year, then by the time Yovel comes around, he has no rights to it anymore. It's completely the buyer's. But that's only with a regular Yisroel. Regarding Leviim, the whole order of redeeming fields and houses is very different. So first of all, they could sell fields even close to the time of Yovel, and they have the right to redeem it right away, again, as opposed to a Yisroel. If they made a field Hekdesh, they gave it to the Beis HaMikdash, they have the right to redeem it from the Hekdesh even after Yovel. When it comes to a house in a walled city, they're not limited to only redeeming it within a year. They can redeem it any time, even after a number of years, because the pasuk says, "Geulas oilam tiyeh lelevim." They can redeem it at any time. They can redeem it always, which seemingly shows that their ownership is a much more permanent one. That is, that even if practically the house or the field is right now in someone else's domain, whether it's Hektish or someone that they sold it to, etc., nevertheless, to a certain extent, they still have some ownership on it. They can always get it back. It's never taken away from them completely. What comes out of all of this is the ownership over Chevron, since it's one of the Ori Mikla that belong to the Levium, belongs to the Levium in a way of Geula Soilim, in other words, in a much more absolute and permanent way. However, says the Rebbe, if we're looking at the fact, the advantage that Chevron is the Ir Mikla that was given to the Levium, you might also argue the other way around. On a certain level, in a certain way, there seems to be that the ownership of the Levim over their cities in some ways is actually weaker than the ownership that the other Shvatim have over their portions. Why is that? So, the din is that Shevet Levi were actually warned that they don't get a proper portion of Eretz Yisrael. They don't have a nachal, an inheritance in Eretz Yisrael. There was only certain cities given to them by the other Yidden. In total, they were given 48 cities. The 6 Ari Miklot, plus another 42 cities were given to them as well. And as we'll see in the continuation, those 42 cities also are dinim of Ari Miklot in certain ways. Slightly different, but they're also considered cities of refuge. So these cities that were given to the Leviim by the rest of the Yidden, the Pasuk says, Arim Lashavas, it was given to them to live in. To dwell in, which seems to be implying that it's not absolutely theirs completely as much as a regular city that belongs to the other Yidden. But the truth is, we'll see now that this is a machloikas of Tanoim, and we'll see that the Rebbe is going to eventually say that lahalacha, it seems like we do accept it, that it is completely theirs. It's not only that because it was given to them, therefore it's somehow not completely theirs, as we'll see now. In the Yerushalmi, it says that there's a machloikus of Tanoim. Reb Meir says that when it comes to vidui meiser, the special things that need to be said when the meiser is brought, amongst them, we're thanking Hashem for the land that you have given us. So Reb Meir says, Koyanim and Levim do not say vidui meiser, because they didn't get a portion in Eretz Yisrael. Rabbi Yossi says they have these Arei Migrash, these cities that were given to them by the rest of the Yidden, which are called Arei Migrash. Because they also had these areas around the city called a Migrash, but they're called Arei Migrash. So Reb Meir holds that the reason why, that's what the Yerushalmi explains, that why is it that they don't say Vidui Maisa? Because even though they were given these cities, it was only given to them to live, but not that it's considered their portion. On the other hand, Rabbi Yossi holds, no, it was given to them as their portion, as their inheritance. So again, according to Rabbi Meir, it would seem that these are not fully theirs. But according to Rabbi Yossi, it comes out that these Arei Migrash do belong fully to the Levium as their portion in Eretz Yisrael. And in fact, that's the way the Rambam paskins. That even though we say in the video, the land that you Hashem gave us, nevertheless, Levium do say this video, even though they didn't get a portion in Eretz Yisrael, but they have these cities, these Arei Migrash that was given to them, which all leads us to say that these Arei Migrash are in fact a full portion of the Levium in Eretz Yisrael. Now the Rebbe is going to bring another Rambam, which is again going to seemingly be going the other way, seemingly implying that the 6 Arei Miklot are not fully the Leviums, but again the Rebbe is going to turn it the other way around. The Rambam paskins that a Reitzeach, a murderer that's living in the Ari Miklot, does not have to pay rent for his house. But that's only regarding the 6 Ari Miklot. If someone lives in the other cities of the Levium, which are also serve as Ari Miklot, but not designated Ari Miklot, but they also have the Dinim of Ari Miklot, so then they do have to pay the rent. Now, what's the reason for this distinction? Seemingly, the Rebbe is going to say that seemingly the Rambam would go with what we're about to say from the Yerushalmi, but then the Rebbe is again going to turn it around and say that's not necessarily what the Rambam is saying. According to the Yerushalmi, see, there's a machloikus whether the Reitzeach has to pay rent for the Levium. The Yerushalmi says that it's based on the same machloikus we said before. That if we say that it was given as their full portion, then it belongs to them, you have to pay them rent. If it was only given for the Levium to live there, then you wouldn't pay rent. Which would then seemingly tell us that the other cities, the 42 cities, fully belong to the Levium, but only the 42 cities, and that's why you have to pay rent over there. But the 6 Arei Miklot, which are obviously specifically designated as Arei Miklot, those are the ones where you don't have to pay rent. Those are the ones where you don't have to pay rent, and we would say seemingly why, because they're fully Arei Miklot, and they don't really belong to the Levium. One of the main differences between these different kinds of Arei Miklot, that these are designated Arei Miklot, is that if a Reitzeach goes in to one of the other 42 cities, if they're unaware, they're not going in intentionally, it's not going to save them. But these 6 Arei Miklot are absolute Arei Miklot, and they would be saved even if they didn't have intention to go in. So again, it seems to be, if the Rambam is saying that these 6 Arei Miklot you would not have to pay rent, then maybe we would say it means it's because it doesn't belong so much to the Levium. But the Rebbe says that's not the case, because according to the Bavli, that's not the way it sounds like at all. From the Bavli, it seems to be saying that the fact that the Reitzeach is not paying rent to the Levi in these 6 Arei Miklot is not because in some way the Levium don't have full ownership over these cities, but rather it's a special halacha that the Gemara learns out from a pasuk. The pasuk says regarding the murderer, "V'hayu lochem ha'arim l'miklot," these cities will be for you as a refuge, which we're learning as meaning lochem means will be for you for all of your needs, so you don't even have to pay rent over there. But it's not because the cities don't fully belong to the Levium. And the Rebbe says that's from the wording of the Rambam, where the Rambam speaks about the ownership of the Levium over the Arei Miklot, and it sounds like all Arei Miklot are exactly the same. The 6 Arei Miklot as well as the other 42. The Rambam says that the Yidden were commanded to give the Levium cities to live in, and the areas around the cities. And those cities are, first of all, the 6 Arei Miklot, along with the other 42 cities. The Rambam says, and when we're going to add Arei Miklot in the times of Mashiach, all of that's also going to be for the Levium, which seems to be telling us that the connection to the Levium of all these cities is exactly the same. So therefore, in summary, we're going back to the original point that the Arei Miklot have this special advantage that it always belongs to the Levium, even by Yovel, etc. Even if they sold it, they could always take it back, etc. Plus, we started suggesting that maybe it doesn't belong fully to the Levium, and now we're saying no, that these cities do fully belong to the Levium. Once it was given to them, it fully belongs to them. The Rebbe now takes it one step further. Not only do the Arei Miklot belong to the Levium, it's actually going to go the other way around. It is an Arei Miklot because it belongs to the Levium. And the Rebbe explains. The Gemara learns out from the pasuk V'samti l'cha makom, that I'm going to make a place where the Ritzeach could run to, etc., etc. So the Gemara says V'samti l'cha means that Hashem is saying to Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm going to make during your lifetime a place from your own area, from your own place, to where the Ritzeach could run. Which tells us that in the time that the Yidden were in the Midbar, if a Yid had to go into exile, if a Yid had to run to the city of refuge, where would he go? To Machne Leviyah. Rashi explains, Mokim Koimcha, that Machne Leviyah should be the one that absorbs, that saves the murderer. And then Rashi continues, Va'af Arei Miklot, and so too, in the future, the Arei Miklot, Yiyu Arei Leviyah is going to be the cities of the Levium. And from Rashi, it seems to be saying that the fact that the Arei Miklot is saving is because it's the city of the Levium. The Rebbe says it's difficult to say that Rashi was only speaking about the other 42 cities which weren't designated as an Ir Miklat, and they're only going to be absorbing because they were given to the Levium. Because then Rashi should have said, Af Ari HaLeviyah Yiyu Kaltis, and also the cities of the Levium would make refuge, etc., or something like that. But from the simple wording of Rashi, Af Ari Miklat Yiyu Ari Leviyah, that also the Ari Miklat are all going to be the cities of the Levium, seems to be saying that he's speaking specifically about the 6 Ari Miklat. So in other words, the fact that the 6 Ari Miklat were given to the Levium is not a side point or a side halacha in regards to the giving of the cities. That is, that in addition to the fact that they're Ir Miklat, there's another halacha they also should be given to the Levium. But rather, it's a din in the very essence of why it's an Ir Miklat. In other words, the fact that they are the cities of the Levium, that's what causes that these cities could now save and absorb the person who ran away there. In other words, that in the 6 Ari Miklat, there is two gedorim. There's two definitions, if you will. In other words, there's number one, that they are Ir Miklat. Specifically as Ari Miklat, they were designated for an Ir Miklat. And as a result of that, they save and they absorb the person, as we said before, whether he's aware of that he came into the city, and that's why he came into the city or not. But even before that, the fact that they're Ari HaLeviyim, that already itself causes them to be an Ir Miklat. In other words, it's just an additional point that they also have a special din of Ir Miklat with extra halachas. Now you might say, what difference does that make? Once they are an Ir Miklat already, then what's the point? But the Rebbe says there is a nafkamina b'poil. Let's say there would be one of the conditions of the 6 Ari Miklat would be lacking. For example, the 6 Ari Miklat, the halacha is they only work once you have all 6 of them designated already. That's when they're going to start functioning. Says the Rebbe, but even before that, the fact that it's one of the cities of the Levium, they already have some dinim of a Ir Miklat, at least at the lesser level, like the level of that if a person does intentionally go in there wanting to be saved, then it will protect him. Says the Rebbe, this idea that it's primarily first a city of Levium, and then because of that it's becoming an Ir Miklat, says the Rebbe, this is also implied when you read the flow of the Parshias, the sections in Parshas Masay. First in the Torah you have the section of a Nosnu Levium, that the Yidden have to give from their portion cities to the Levium to live in. And it discusses the cities that you'll give to the Levium, about the 6 Ari Miklat that were Ritzeach Karan, in addition to the other 42 cities. Then comes the Parsha that discusses of designating these cities of Ari Miklat where Ritzeach could actually run there. In other words, even before it has the actual din of absorbing the murder as in the 6 Ari Miklat, number one, it becomes Ari HaLeviyim, it becomes the city of the Levim. That's point number one. And then it's also going to have this idea that it can absorb the Ritzeach. In fact, says the Rebbe, this says clearly in the Chinuch, where he's explaining the reason that the Ari HaLeviyim actually saved this person. As the Pasuk says, as the Chinuch says, that these cities, amongst the cities of the Levium, you also had certain cities that were specifically as an Ir Miklat. But all of them had this concept. They were all worked as an Ir Miklat, but some of them were designated specifically for that. Says the Chinuch, it's because of the great Maila, because of the great virtues of the Levium, because of all their great deeds, because of how precious they are, and how valuable they are. That is why their land, their cities were chosen to save, to absorb the person who killed by mistake more than any other shevet. Why? Perhaps the special kedusha that's in the land of the Levium will be a kapara for this person. So in other words, these Sheish Ari Miklat as well have the same geder as cities of the Levium, just like all the other 42 cities, which then tells us that also these 6 Ari Miklat were given over to their full ownership. And as a result of that, that is why these cities have this din that they absorb, that they save people. Says the Rebbe, but based on all of this, the question now goes the other way. If in fact the cities were given to the Levium as their portion in the land, why is the Pasuk referring to it as you're just giving them cities, Losheves, to live in, to dwell in, as if it's not fully theirs? Says the Rebbe, we can explain it as follows. The fact that these cities belong to the Levium is number one, the idea that all the Yidden are giving from their portions to the Levium. And therefore we find something very very different in regards to the portion of the Levim to the portions of the other Shvatim, that these 48 cities are scattered, they're spread out over many or all of the Shvatim, because it's something coming from all of the Yidden. Point number 2, says the Rebbe, the way Shevet Levi owns this is a general bias, a general ownership from the whole Shevet. In other words, the whole Shevet owns these places. These 48 cities are given to Shevet Levi. But each individual Levi doesn't have an individual bias, individual ownership over his specific house. That's what the pasuk is saying. It's only l'sheves, it's only to live in. Says the Rebbe. This is then one of the explanations also in the order of how the cities came to the Levim. How was it? The pasuk says that the Yidden gave to the Levim from their cities, from their inheritance. In other words, it's the inheritance of Bnei Yisrael, and this is the way the Bnei Yisrael are giving it over, these cities, to the Levim. Says the Rebbe, now we can also understand what we brought all the way in the beginning, where the Medrash says, the special chidush that Chevron came up in the Geirel of 4. First it was to Yehuda, Shevet Yehuda, then it went to Kalev, and then ultimately it ends up by the Levim, the Kohanim and the Levim. What's the idea? We just said that the other Ari Levim came in a general way to the whole Shevet. But here's what we have unique about Chevron. Chevron was not just given in a general way from Bnei Yisrael to Shevet Levi. Rather, Chevron came to Shevet Levi through Kalev. That means it had first gone over from this general ownership of Shevet Yehuda to the individual ownership of Kalev. And that's what the Medrash is saying, that Hoya Oilet came up in the lottery of 4. That means that they're all 4 in the same category in a certain sense. In other words, in the same way as it was originally. Well, first it was Yehuda, but then it went to Kalev. In other words, it went to a Bailos Pratis, an individual ownership. So too now, when it got passed on to the Levim, it's also in a unique way that the Levim own it in a personal way, not just in a general way. And since the connection of the Ari Levim to the Levim is in a way, as we said earlier, in an eternal way, Geulas Olam, that they can always have the rights to it, etc. And so therefore it comes out that the ownership of by Levim and Chevron is something unique and different compared to all other parts of Eretz Yisrael. Because number one, as one of the Shvatim of the Levi, one of the portions of the Levim, so it's different to the rest of the Nachlos of Bnei Yisrael, who cannot take back land forever. But the portion of Shevet Levi, in this case Chevron, can be. But furthermore, even as opposed to the other cities of the Levim, in the other cities of the Levim, there isn't this concept of a personal ownership, and in Chevron there is. The Rebbe now moves on to explain this b'pnimi Yisrael. The inner reason why the Ari Miklat in fact have to be from the Levims, similar something to what the Chinuch said before, is because it's connected to be as a protection and a kapara and atonement for the person that killed by mistake. When a person kills somebody else, there's a double thing happening, a double sin and a double separation. There's the sin and the separation that's happening between man and Hashem, and that which is happening between man and his fellow. And therefore, in the kapara through the Ir Miklat, has to be specifically in the Ari Levim. Because the word Levi, the name Levi, comes from the word Yilava Ishie Lai. It's a notion of attachment. It's a connection. The pasuk says, "Hapam Yilava." We're going to make a new bond, a new connection. This is what Levi was saying. Leah was saying when Levi was born, that Yaakov is going to be connected to her, etc. In other words, the idea of Levi is the opposite of separation, and that's exactly what Leviim are, making this bond, making this separation, this connection. What is Shevet Levi all about? Shevet Levi, number one, was separated to serve the Eibishter, and their idea is also to teach Hashem's ways, Hashem's righteous ways to the public. In other words, because of their special connection with Hashem, they are Hashem's heritage. And therefore, they are the ones that are able to achieve the kapara, the tikkun, for that sin, for that separation that happened between Adam Lamokim, of this person that killed someone. And once again, there could be this connection that he has with Hashem. So that's number one, bin Adam Lamokim. Number two, their avoid is v'yilavu alecha v'yishar sucha. It's all about working and assisting in the Beis Hamikdash, helping the Kohanim and working for and helping the Yidden, etc. So So this expresses an idea of Achdus Yisrael. In addition to the fact that their idea is to teach the public the ways of Hashem. So here again we have this idea that their inyan is about Avas Yisrael. Says the Rebbe, and it's therefore that their cities become the tikkun, the correction for this sin, this separation between Adam Lachaveiroi, the person who killed somebody else. Says the Rebbe, now this would be true in all the Ari Miklat. But now we're going to focus more on the idea of Chevron, with the inyan of Achdus is even more emphasized. Because there we have the burial sites of the Avos and the Imois of all Bnei Yisrael. This is also why the Tfilos of all the Yidden go up through Chevron. And Tfilah itself, the Rebbe brings, is called Chevron because it's at the time of davening is a time of combining all of our midas of Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, our Avas Hashem, Yiras Hashem, etc. It's all about our connection with the Eibishter, which is again going to be the kapara that one needs, being Adam Lamokim, that the Hoyrig Nefesh needs. And since the Avos and the Imois are the ancestors of all of Klal Yisrael, so it's through the Chibur of the Avos and the Imois of Klal Yisrael all together, through this connection of all of them together, of the Avos together and the Imois together, this also brings about the true connection in the children, the sons and daughters that come from them, and therefore this causes the kapara for the Chay Sheben Adam L'Chaveiroi. The Rebbe says, in fact, this idea of the Chibur, that Chevron causes this attachment, is to such an extent that it comes out in a revealed way. In the name that it's called in Lashon HaKodesh, the very name of the city, Chevron, is from the word Chibur, which means attachment.